And welcome back to the Velocity Institute Europe Virtual Summit. I'm excited now to welcome Malachi O'Connor from IPLC. Malachi, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us, Chris. Thank you. A quick introduction. My name is Malachi O'Connor. I work with IPLC, International Private Label Consult. There's 12 consultants in 10 different European countries, and we come from both sides of the table. We're ex-buyers, commercial directors, as well as sales directors and supply side experience. But the common denominator is that we have skills and experience in the private label world. And what we do is provide strategic consulting for any element within the private label supply chain. More of our customers are manufacturers, but we also provide strategy consulting for retailers all around the world. And then other parties like ingredients or packaging manufacturers who want to understand the dynamics of this growing world of private label. So that's a little bit about what we do.
And tell us a little bit about your background too. I know you have worked for a retailer or two.
Yeah, retailer or two. So I studied food science, and during that time I did a year out with Marks and Spencer in their head office in London in Baker Street, when it was based there. Got a real buzz for retail, and joined an indigenous Irish retailer called Dunn's Stores in Dublin back in 1997. Got my first buying job in Dunn's, moved to another Irish retailer called Superquinn. They were very, very focused on copying the best of what was happening in the States, actually, very focused on fresh food. Went to Spar for 4 years, had a great time there. Then I got a director position in Aldi as a buying director, worked with lots of categories, lots of fresh food categories particularly, but not only that. And had an opportunity to become their marketing director in Ireland. So I was involved in lots of cool strategy stuff at a time when the business was really growing. Got headhunted to join Tesco to try and win some market share back from Aldi, and finished there after about 3 years. Finished there at the end of 2016, and I've been consulting since then. And one of the avenues of consulting is with IPLC, because it's a great little community. As a consultant, for me, it's not satisfying to work on my own. It's great to be part of a community of other consultants and work on bigger projects with a few extra people. It's really satisfying.
Well, so that's a great background. So I'm going to hop off and let you do your presentation. I think Malachi's got some great insights on this, so stay tuned.
Thank you, Chris. So let's hop into this presentation. This presentation comes as a result of research that we did in the first few months of 2024, but also on the back of several years of research that we've done through 21, 22, and 23. And really what we were looking at is pricing strategy. So the agenda for today's presentation, we'll look at the context of this piece of research. I'll share some findings with you. By no means all of the findings, but if you go to the IPLC website, you'll be able to download the research report for free. And then some actions that will come out of our findings. First of all, then, the context for doing this piece of research to try and find out more about pricing strategy. In 2022, we did a piece of research called Surviving the Cost Crisis. What we had observed since really halfway through 2020 was rising oil prices, energy prices, distribution, food prices, etc. As a result of the disruption that came from the global COVID pandemic. What we also observed, though, was that as these price increases were coming through to private label manufacturers, the manufacturers were not having much luck in getting price increases away with their retailer customers. So it was well into 2021 before we started seeing any kind of inflation flowing through to customers. Well into 2021 and 22 before we started seeing inflation flowing through to customers and shoppers. In 2023, we looked at what had happened during 22 when everybody had fingers crossed. They'd hoped that all of the pandemic disruption would settle down, but then the war in Ukraine started, and that created another degree of disruption, sent prices sky high. Just enormous problems for the industry to a point that actually it was much easier to get a cost increase in that environment than it had been a year earlier. And there was a tsunami of cost increases coming at retail buyers. And really, for the first time, the balance of power was shifting, and manufacturers had to get cost increases through. or else they risked their very existence. And retailers who had not seen any real inflation, apart from maybe category-specific inflation, had seen 10 years of deflation up until this point. So there were many retail buyers who'd never actually handled a cost increase. It was all cost decreases for the 10 preceding years. So it was tough, but the suppliers realized their power because the retailers didn't have access to options, and they needed to make sure that products stayed on shelf. There was no point in having a low price in the system or on the price ticket if the product wasn't available. So looking at that balance of power is what we did in 2023. We realized then that we had looked at the perspective of manufacturers in surviving the cost crisis. We'd taken the perspective of retailers and buyers in the balance of power research. And the main key stakeholder that we hadn't actually looked at was the impact of all of this on shoppers and their behaviors, etc. And that prompted a brainstorming session, and we decided that we would look at the retail price on the shelf for a core range of products that we had also looked at several years previously. So it was going to be quite useful to see what had changed. So we did our brainstorm, we came up with our project objectives, and then we deployed our team to do a survey across Europe. We picked 65 common products across the key categories. So it was a really representative weekly shop or trolley. And we looked at a bunch of different retailers in all those different countries. First of all, we took Lidl as the common representative of discounters, because Aldi or other indigenous discounters generally try to match Lidl. So we just price checked Lidl, and then we took the market leader and one other within each of the markets. So we didn't look at every retailer, but it was enough to get a good idea of the pricing strategy and the dynamics that were ongoing in that market. And then we had to bring a lot of data together then, 7,600 product and price and pack size references in 9 countries, and identify some takeouts from that. And that's what we're going to present to you today. The findings then were really interesting, actually, because we had done this trolley of goods, more or less exactly the same list of products in several occasions previously in 2021 and then in 2016. And between 2016 and 21, we'd seen some interesting differences, that the difference between discounter private label products and branded products hadn't really changed so much between 2016 and 2021. But what we'd seen is that the private label products that were stocked in mainstream supermarkets had become much more competitive all around Europe. Mainstream supermarkets were investing in reducing prices in their private label ranges so they could stem this seemingly unstoppable growth of the limited range discounters. A lot of that action had already happened up until 2021. So when we were hit with 2 phases of severe inflation and a cost crisis, we were expecting to see quite a lot of differences. And what we found when we price checked was actually after 5 turbulent years, we had a climate crisis, we got a global pandemic, you got Russia invading Ukraine, disruption in supply chains globally, and an inflation crisis which is impacting the average household's ability to feed itself. All of that turbulence, and really the indices didn't change that much. But the inflation did impact the retail selling prices. It's just that everything moved up to proportionately a kind of similar impact. And the other thing that we noticed is that the brand versus private label mix has changed quite significantly. So these are subtle and they're nuanced, but really interesting observations after 5 years of significant turbulence. If we look at private label value share in the different markets around Europe, we can see that private label share of sales has increased in all of those markets: Portugal, Ireland, Spain, Germany, Belgium, Italy, UK, Netherlands, and France between 2021 and 2023. And we all know the reasons for that. We know that discounters who are primarily private label operators, they're opening new stores, they're revamping old stores, they're expanding their reach to shoppers, and that automatically grows private label market share. But then the established supermarkets, then the mainstream supermarkets with their bigger ranges, they're deploying their various discounter mitigation strategies, which includes increasing their private label ranges and increasing the prominence of those private label ranges, the quality, the packaging, the brand and hierarchies. So the mainstream supermarkets are doing a much better job on their private label proposition now than they were back in 2016 or 2021. And lots of that is around price matching strategies, dropping prices and getting close to the discounters so the shoppers don't really have a reason to go to a discounter and can actually access competitive products at acceptable quality with a wider range and maybe a nicer shopping experience in a big supermarket. So all of this was happening, and you throw a cost of living crisis on top of it, and shoppers who were then forced to seek value were able to do that by switching into private label if they were branded shoppers. And the degree of inflation that we're talking about was really, really epic. If you look between 2021 and 2024, we looked at the month of March, that degree of inflation in food and drink packaged groceries means that a 100 euro trolley of goods, a weekly shop, is now costing nearly 130 euros. So it's approaching 30% of compound inflation impact. And that's a big challenge for shoppers because wages haven't grown by 30% in that time period. So I mentioned to you that mainstream supermarkets were deploying these various discounter mitigation strategies. And here's an example which is very close to home for me in the Irish market. Not a huge market, but a really interesting one, really competitive, and a test market for some of these strategies. You can see how the discounters, which are the yellow and orange line there, Aldi and Lidl, were taking a long time underneath the radar to expand their reach and to introduce Irish customers to the discount concept. And the established players at the top of the screen, Tesco, Dunnes, SuperValu, the red, blue and green lines, really they were able to absorb 15 years of discounter growth without having massive impact on their market share. When the discounters really started to catch on and observe this herd effect, the market share of the three key multiples kind of fell off the cliff. And Tesco, as the leader of those three multiples, decided they would price match the discounters across a range of about 1,500 items. And what it did was effectively stopped market share losses for the mainstreamers, but also it stopped the growth of the discounters for about 5 years. And what it showed is that if you can price match discounters on a wide enough range, you can get them to stop opening new stores, because that's the primary way that they expand their market share. If you think about 3 years, any retailer will have a pipeline of new store openings that extends back for about 3 years from a point of maybe buying the site, planning the site, having the planning permission, going through the build and then getting to opening. So if you can match them on price and limit their growth for about 3 years, what's in the pipeline flows through and they stop opening stores. Certainly they reduce the rate at which they open stores, and you can actually really effectively halt the growth of discounters. So that's what happened in the Irish market. We'll come back to that later. So if you look at the country level data then, and get an understanding of why inflation and shoppers and discounters and private label have different dynamics in different countries. What we identified was three variables. First of all is, before you go into an inflation crisis, then if a country, how much of the household expenditure is actually spent on food and drink, on groceries, and it varies quite widely for different reasons. Take Portugal there, 18% of the average household expenditure was on groceries. That's probably because the average earnings in Portugal are quite low. In Ireland, then, the next line down, only 8.3% of a household's expenditure was being spent on groceries. That's a reflection of two things. First of all, the discounters have very, very high penetration, so Irish customers don't need to spend too much on their groceries, but also a reflection of the fact that the average salary is significantly higher in that country. So when you combine all of those different dynamics, how price sensitive is the country and the shoppers before an inflation crisis? How much inflation did they have to deal with? Was it 25 or 30 or more percent? And then how high was the discounter share in terms of access? It's an indicator of access to private label. All of those things combine then to result in a situation where Portugal, for example, their private label sales grew 53% between 2021 and 2023. And lots of other countries saw similar growth rates over that 2 or 3 years in private label sales. So we think that's a really, really market example of how customers find solutions for their problems. So looking at that 24 versus 21 comparison, the EU average food inflation was almost 30%. Private label sales grew by 39% over that group of countries, but as high as 53% in countries like Portugal. Branded sales grew only at 22.5%, which is below inflation, which means that branded volumes are falling. And private label's share of sales grew from 36.3% to 39.3% across all of those countries. So we're already talking about territories that have very high private label penetration, growing a significant degree during this inflation crisis. And all of that growth is driven by those three baseline factors: how price sensitive was the market before the inflation crisis, what was the share of the discounters and therefore the access to and the share of private label, and what degree of food inflation did they experience at a country level. And that was an interesting takeout, because wherever you are in the world, you can use those three variables to maybe predict what might happen over the coming years. So going back to the price research then, we had this trolley of 65 items. We were looking at it across different retailers, discounters, mainstream supermarkets, different countries, different categories. And we were trying to capture the indices between mid-tier private label, premium private label brands, but then also the entry price, the value private label. And I'm going to share some of the observations that we made in that respect. First of all, then, the difference between the price of standard tier private label in supermarkets versus the equivalent products in discounters. And Lidl was our example here. And we found huge variance. The highest number there is for Dunnes Stores in the Irish market, where they were about 32% higher than the equivalent product in Lidl for the standard tier, the mid-tier of private label products. Co-op Italy then was around 23% higher than the equivalent Lidl product in the Italian market. But then at the far end of the scale, you've got retailers in Portugal and in Germany and in France, where on a certain range of products, they're tagging very, very closely to the discounter equivalent. In Edeka and in Leclerc in France, you can see it's below 5%. It's 3-4% of difference between the supermarket's private label and the discounter's private label, which means they're watching them very, very closely. What we have observed, though, is the commercial reality of this. In a retailer that is matching very, very closely to the discounter's price, they're probably choosing to do that on a narrow range, a list of lines that really matter, or SKUs that really matter to their shoppers. If they're matching more loosely, like in Morrison's UK, Deleuze in Belgium, Co-op in Italy, then they're probably commercially able to do that exercise on a broader range, or they may deploy value tier private label much more widely. And they also have the funding available, the commercial firepower to be able to invest in some quite interesting loyalty schemes. And we'll come back to that in one of the later slides. So that was standard tier private label in a supermarket versus a discounter. Now looking at the value tier then, how much cheaper than the standard tier is it across all of these countries? And again, some significant variance, starting with Morrison's in the UK, who it's more than 35% cheaper than the equivalent standard tier private label product. But then even the lowest discount in retailers like Continente in Portugal or Carrefour in Spain is still 10-15% cheaper than standard tier private label. But that price difference actually doesn't tell the full story. The really interesting thing is that between 2021 and 2024, when we did the research, the SKU count, the range size of private label, has increased by 34% in all of those countries and all of those retailers. So supermarkets and discounters are actually deploying value tier private label ranges much more widely now to try and give options to shoppers that are under budget pressure. They're not just expanding the range, they're rebranding, redesigning and relaunching their value tier ranges. And what's also interesting is that in that inflationary period, brands saw the average price increase by 27%, The mid-tier private label went up by 31%, but the value tier private label prices went up by 36%. That's explained, I think, by the fact that the retail price that's on shelf for a value product, most of that is actually the cost of the product rather than the margin that's made on the product. So it's an expression of the fine margins that retailers are probably making on value tier private label products. But it's still cheaper than the other options and therefore attractive to a cohort of shoppers. If you think about the history of value tier private label, take the Tesco example. They introduced Tesco Value in 1993, and it was a range and a design, a proposition that, looking at it now, it doesn't appear that they really wanted to sell much of it. And they softened it and modernized it 20 years later in 2012, but it was still clearly a value tier product. But we're seeing really a huge amount of interesting work on the value tier now, such that the retailers that are stocking a value tier have really modernized and softened the aesthetic of value tier products. If you have them in your trolley, there's no sense of shame as you go through the till or up and down the aisles. And there's really commonly two approaches that retailers take. If you look at Asda, top right, the UK retailer, the name Asda is above the door of the store, and it's also on their value tier ranges, their Just Essentials range, which has that common bright yellow color across the entire range. It's a really, really good signpost if you want the cheapest product that's on display in any category. And there's hundreds of products across the store. So that's a good example of where the retailer's name is on the pack. Underneath that, you've got Tesco and Sainsbury's, where they're using heritage names to brand their value names or their value tier brands. Sainsbury's on the right-hand side there, the Stamford Street Co. range. Stamford Street was the first location that Sainsbury's ever opened. So they're using their history and using the address of that location to represent value to customers in the inflation crisis. And what we also see is that there are very few retailers around Europe now who still have that sparse, white, poverty kind of look to their value tier products. So very few examples of that. And this is true also all around the European countries, like Reve in Germany, El Campo in Spain, Edeka, Esselunga, even Aldi. They've softened, they've modernized, and they've actually got some really cool, funky designs for their value tier products now. So we think that's a real interesting change and development since the last time we've looked at it. If we think about the role of brands and premium private label, this is another interesting observation that we've made, again, just within the indices that we observed. From the 2024 research, we found that the average premium private label product sells at a 79% premium to its equivalent mid-tier private label product. But it's also cheaper than its equivalent branded product, whilst also probably being at a higher specification. So, and it's not just about premium private label products that are in the black packaging design, where they're better quality and they've got a really interesting provenance story. Anywhere that customers are willing to pay a premium for a particular need, like organic foods, vegan foods, or regional specialities, retailers are using those products to get a premium from their shoppers. And what we've seen is that if premium private label is 79% more expensive than the mid-tier private label, the brands then are 117% more expensive than the mid-tier private label. So you could have shoppers that are brand loyal switching to premium private label, and that achieves a saving for that particular cohort of shoppers. And they're actually probably having a nicer food experience now. To finish off on this piece, we've noticed that the discounters are selling way more brands than they used to. And there's lots of different schools of thought as to why that may be. Maybe they're responding to the needs of particular shoppers who maybe there's a no compromise. They only buy the branded product for particular categories. It could be that. It could also be that it enhances the value proposition of private label products. If you have a private label product beside the equivalent brand, and there's maybe a 2 or a 3 or a 4 times ratio between the retail prices, then it really says something about the value that's offered by private label. But really, the third point there around margin mix benefits, we think that that's really the key thing. And it's really interesting that discounters are stocking a lot more brands now, because it would suggest that they have reached a point where their efficiency and their buying power isn't addressing the need for more margin, and that they need to stock some brands to be able to achieve that, which is really not something they would have done 10, 15, 20 years ago. It would all have been about a ultra simplistic range, one product for every customer need, and no real need to have the brand on sale. So that's quite a significant development that we've observed. The last bullet point, we talked around margin mix. Just to bring this to life, I've done a little bit of guesswork and brainstorming with my IPLC colleagues. So this is by no means behind the scenes, but it does indicate the kind of way that mix works within categories. I've taken the example of the pasta sauce category and looked at the Aldi business in Ireland. They've got one value tier, everyday essentials pasta sauce, that sells at 65 cents. There's 440 grams in that jar. Then they have three tiers, three varieties of mid-tier Cucina private label pasta sauce, which sells at 85 cents and is a 500-gram jar. Interestingly, then they've got one Dolmio, which is the branded product that comes from Mars, at $3.49 for a 750-gram jar. And between the mid-tier and the brand, you've got Specially Selected, which is the premium private label product, selling at $1.99 for a 350-gram jar. But there's 10 different varieties of that. So that even just the SKU count would indicate where the focus of a discount retailer is, in a range which is now actually quite complex compared to where it might have been 10, 15 years ago. And if you do some guesswork around the gross margin, the rate of sale of these products, you can see how this all hangs together, such that if a retailer wants to have a credible low price on a value tier product, they're probably not going to make any margin on that. And if there's any volume going through that, that's going to drag down the average margin and the average price, the average selling price in the category. So if you're going to do that, you have to mitigate that with a good solid mid-tier without giving it away, and a really strong premium private label, and maybe a brand presence within the category to try and make that margin mix actually work for the retailer. So I thought we'd share that just to give a little insight into how this is working in retailer head office. We've seen over the last couple of years a lot of emotion actually really around, are the retailers gouging? Are they taking too much margin? And what we were able to see through our price research, and also by desk research looking at the central statistics offices of the various countries, is that shoppers have absorbed a really significant cost increases on their groceries, their food and drink over these few years. But a really quick search of some key international retailers would suggest that the retailers aren't really making significantly more or less operating margins within that time period. We looked at 2019 up to 2023 for some big retailers like Tesco, Carrefour, Aldi, Walmart, and Ahold Delhaize. And whilst there was a dip in 2021, it wasn't significant. And the green line, the average across those 5 years for those 5 big retailers, really is unchanged. So certainly in this market, in these markets in Europe, we haven't seen any significant wide-scale examples of gouging. So coming to a close then, remember value traditionally for a buyer like me was a combination of price and quality, and customers could work that out as well. They were willing to pay more for something that was higher quality or more added value, and it still added value to them. They could see the logic. But what we've noticed over the last few years is that when you go through an inflation crisis and the buyers aren't willing to pay a certain price, then availability issues become inevitable. And so value is a combination now of price and quality, but also availability, is it on the shelf, and sustainability. And we're seeing lots of different ways around Europe where retailers are expressing their value proposition, not just in price and quality, but also sustainability and availability. Tesco are now price matching. In fact, the big 4 or 5 retailers in the UK are now price matching Aldi and Lidl, and it's starting to have an impact on the growth rates of the discounters in that big market in the UK. They're not just price matching the discounters, they're also offering their promotions, their branded promotions, only through their club card, their loyalty card mechanism. So that's given them a lot of access to data that they didn't previously, because there were lots of transactions that didn't use the club card previously, but it's the only way you can access those offers now. If you remember one of the earlier slides, the difference between mid-tier private label in a supermarket versus a discounter, the highest difference was in Dunnes stores in Ireland. What I didn't tell you at the time was that Dunnes have invested all of that into a voucher mechanism. So every time you spend €50 in Dunnes stores, they give you €10 back in a voucher that needs to be used within a week or a week and a half. So it's a very sticky mechanism for encouraging loyalty and large shops, and it's really working for them because they're the leading retailer in the Irish market, where there is also the presence of Aldi and Lidl and Tesco. So it's really, really competitively effective. On the far right-hand side here, you can see K Group and S Group in the Finnish market, where they're doing some really interesting things with their loyalty card. When you sign up for a loyalty card, you automatically get a bank account, and your points that you might collect through your transactions are lodged in your account. So in one of those retailers, I think it's on the 10th of the month, they have payday, but it's effectively your second payday, where they give you the cash that you've then earned through all of your transactions across their group. It goes directly into your account. One of the other retailers then gives you the option to, instead of taking that cash into your account, you can invest it in stocks within their portfolio. So now you're encouraging your shoppers to be investors or shareholders actually in the company. And then in all of that, then lots of different diverse ways to express a value proposition. You've got discounters like Lidl, who are effectively adding complexity to their winning formula. So the Lidl Plus app has really taken off. It's very, very popular with shoppers as a way to access product bonuses. So maybe a free product one week or a price reduction on a private label product in another week. And it's really, really attractive to shoppers, but it's certainly adding complexity to what was an ultra simplistic discounter proposition. So the key themes then that are coming from this, and the things that you need to consider when you're making decisions and taking actions over the coming years, then it's still an ultra competitive sector. FMCG, I often think it should be VFMCG, very fast moving consumer goods. Super competitive, that hasn't changed. But all of the players in the market are managing their margin mix, not just through their pricing strategy, but through their mix strategy. They're using private label and the tiers within private label and brands as strategic levers. And if they adjust the mix of sales of those products, then they can achieve their margin goals. Remember that price is only one element of value, and the mainstream supermarkets particularly are expressing their value proposition in much more diverse ways that take into account the environment of the store, the loyalty schemes, voucher schemes, private label price hierarchies, range expansions and simplifications. So they're really sweating their abilities as more complex organizations now, really for the first time. And as a result, they're getting a handle on this discounter threat that has existed for many years. And they've proven in many markets that the discounter growth can be brought to a halt. It doesn't mean that there won't still be downward cost pressure. Discounters and mainstream supermarkets, they want to see cost reductions that they can pass on to their shoppers after a period of really market inflation. So manufacturers will need to deal with that and will need to invest in commercial skills training like sales and negotiation skills. But retailers still need great supplier partners. They need those supplier partners for the innovation that will provide differentiation versus their competitors. They need those great supplier partners to provide well-invested, transparent, and ultra-efficient supply chains so that it's the best cost for the best product when it arrives into the central depot. And now, kind of more than ever, they need those great supplier partners to have credible corporate sustainability strategies, because for the first time ever within the EU, it's legislatively required that the countries, the nations have a sustainability strategy at a national level to reduce their carbon footprint. And if a country has a requirement to reduce its carbon footprint, that will flow down to the industries that act in that country. And this food industry is a big part of that. So the retailers will be expected to make their contribution, but 95% of the carbon footprint of food and drink groceries actually isn't with the retailers. It's with the suppliers and the farmers and all downstream. So this is going to come down to suppliers, and it's going to become a significantly greater part of all of the manufacturers of private label, a significantly greater part of their proposition, their value proposition, when they're going talking to retailers and hoping to win private label contracts and business. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you on this webinar. I've shared my contact details there. You're all welcome to check out the IPLC website. You can see all of the reports that we've produced over the years, those research reports. I exist on LinkedIn, so you can have a look for Malachy O'Connor. You'll find me on LinkedIn sharing insights and from the industry and the work that we do. And if you want to email me, it's mo'connor@iplc-europe.com. Chris, did you have any questions that you wanted to share?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you very much. That's a lot of data. I'm sure people will love that, and I love the effort by you and the team. So I'm curious, do you have a sense? It's easy to look at all of those percentages and go 35%. That's a lot. But in many cases, we're talking about products that are less than a pound that are right. Do you have a sense for how where consumers start to notice and care between the pricing at the different stores?
If I talk back to you, Chris, then is it about where is the tipping point where a shopper transitions from one tier into another tier? Yeah.
Well, not the tier necessarily.
We didn't
necessarily, but the store, honestly. So if my price is 35% more than Aldi's price or Lidl's price or whoever it is, when do they notice?
Yeah. So I mean, I've worked in retailers during those kinds of time periods where, for example, in Tesco, when we collected the price proposition, and what we found was that, when it is like 20 or 30% more expensive, the wider range, the nicer store, the friendly bag packing service, all of those things start to become less relevant. And if the retailer is that far out on price, they're effectively pushing customers out the door and into the arms of a competitor like a discounter. But that doesn't necessarily happen as soon as the shopper is paying more, because the discounter may not be present in a particular town. So there's lots of different dynamics around store opening programs, marketing programs, and pricing strategies. All of that has to mix up. And even at that, there's a lot of customers who just love the habitual nature of going to the same store, knowing the same staff, buying the same products all of the time. So a lot of the time, you really have to offend a customer before they'll switch to a competitor.
Well, I mean, nobody's surprised that Lidl's cheaper than Marks and Spencer. I think they kind of know that, right? It's all the spaces in between. I love the pasta sauce example. That is one of the ones I look at all the time, because honestly, I think it is the most unnecessarily complicated set in the world. There's just so many versions of it. In the US here at the store I shop, when I was in the other day in Aldi, and there was 7 different. There was one national brand. There was 2 organic versions, all those ones you showed, and there was they were doing their authentic Italian that month, so there was a made in Italy version as well. Yeah, it's a lot of cool stuff. I'll tell you, they're making great products.
They are, but it's so much more complex than it was 10 or 15 years ago, and we don't have a slide on it because it's quite new news. The more people I talk to around Europe, there are more and more examples of territories where discounters like Aldi and Lidl are actually hitting a plateau. So if you look at some of those Nordic markets, I know that Lidl have stopped growing in the Irish market. Aldi have actually declined over the last 6 months, and they're flattening in the UK market. Lidl is the biggest discounter in the French market, and they're flat now as well. They're not seeing that kind of growth because the mainstream supermarkets are doing a really good job of matching and now outperforming them.
Well, and how many more stores can you build?
That's it. Well, you can build what's in the pipeline, and then you stop.
Yeah, so at some point, those aren't that big a country, so there's only so many stores you get. This has been a great presentation. Please, if you guys have questions for Malachy, he'll be around. Reach out on LinkedIn. I appreciate you joining us for this. It's been some great insights. Tell you and the team fabulous work. And until next time, this is the end of this piece of it. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris.